I'm Jerome Hill. Welcome to the Hill of Justice. Today on Hill of Justice, I'm honored to have retired Clayton County Sheriff Victor Hill on our show as he prepares for the release of his highly anticipated book next week, Vigilante Sheriff. He wants you to decide, was he a vigilante sheriff or a dedicated public servant who made tough and necessary choices in the name of justice? In Vigilante Sheriff, Victor Hill reflects on his career, the controversies surrounding him, and the legal battles that ultimately led to his incarceration. He leaves it up to the reader to determine whether his actions were justified or went too far. Today, we'll hear from him directly as he shares his story, the lessons he's learned, and what he hopes to achieve with the release of this book. Join us for an inside look at the life and the career of this trailblazing sheriff. Welcome, Sheriff Hill. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
Man, I'm doing outstanding. And just as a full disclosure, Victor Hill is my older brother. So I just wanted to put that out there. But it's great to have you on. I read the book a couple weeks ago. This is a great read. And I really want to get into the nuts and bolts of your leadership style, because I think that this is what really dictated this book. And I think that also, as I mentioned to you before, you're pretty much of a jokester in this book, and we'll get over into that. And we're going to have to get you back on, certainly, because this can easily last about 4 or 5 hours. So,
I'm glad you enjoyed it, brother.
I really did. And so, this is one of the questions I want to ask. In the book Vigilante Sheriff, you delve into what we call your unique approach to law enforcement. Now, I found it to be just common sense, but what inspired you to write the book, and what message are you trying to hope that the readers take away from your experience as the author?
Well, what inspired me to write the book actually is in a dedication. For those not familiar, I was incarcerated for violating inmate civil rights. And while I was incarcerated, it was inmates that actually asked me and inspired me to write the book and helped me write the book and edit it and everything like that, which was kind of ironic because I was actually in prison for violating the inmates' criminal rights. And they became my advocates. They actually helped write stuff for the appeal. But, Vigilante Sheriff is it's a lot of different things. Okay. Number one, the reason for the title is I was often compared to a vigilante, and how that came to one of the most famous fictional vigilantes, and how that came to be is in the book. But I think what's more important is probably the backstory and how the criminal justice system is often misused to target people. If you have a political enemy and they just happen to be a prosecutor, that can be a problem because, as we know, you can indict anyone for anything. Thus, the old quote, you can indict a ham sandwich, which is very, very true. And if you look at the background of how this case started, it didn't start from complaints from inmates saying our rights were violated, that we thought we were placed in a restraint chair and we shouldn't. They were actually solicited. It all started from a political campaign with a deputy that I fired and arrested who was friends with the DA, and one of his campaign workers who had a lot of brushes with the law, who had to be restrained before because of his aggressive behavior. It suddenly became an issue then. Not one time have we ever had a lawsuit or even an internal complaint about the use of the chair. The chair was used a total of 630 times. I think I'm documented as authorizing its use 10 out of those 630 times. And suddenly I became the subject of a criminal investigation. And I ended up being charged and convicted for something that no one's ever been charged or convicted for in the history of the United States. And let me just add this. There's case law that's come from the U.S. Supreme Court. Ironically, two rulings at the time I was indicted that said you can't criminally prosecute someone for a crime that's not clearly established as being a crime. And there is no case law or any thing on point anywhere in the nation that someone can find where someone's prosecuted for authorizing the use of the restraint chair. It just doesn't exist.
Right. So let's go back to the use of the restraint chair, particularly in Clayton County Jail. Of course, obviously, it was the focal point in their trial. Now, restraint chairs are considered controversial, but for people and for the audience that doesn't really know about restraint chairs, what do law enforcement use those restraint chairs for?
Well, let me speak specifically on what we did. If you look at our checklist, there's three reasons we use a restraint chair: for aggressive behavior, destructive behavior, and suicidal behavior. And everyone that I put in a chair, you could check at least one. Some of them you probably could check all three. Uh, that's the reason that it is used. Uh, in our policy, it clearly says that you can use a chair for preventative reasons, meaning that because of a person's aggressive behavior or what we're trained in every year in use of force is having pre-attack indicators, that's a person that we feel should be restrained for our safety, their safety, and the safety of others. Uh, we know for a fact it worked because after my prosecution and after the jail stopped using the safety restraint chair for safety preventative reasons, we had 5 murders in the jail. We'd never had any murders in the jail the 15 years that I was sheriff. Let me give you a great example I think that everybody probably can relate to. Uh, the prosecution said that the people I put in the chair weren't uncontrollably violent at the time they were put in the chair. Well, first of all, I don't know if you can put a person in a chair that's uncontrollably violent. The reason for that chair is to stop them from getting to that point. But let's look at this as an example. There's a Netflix series that was highly acclaimed called The Blacklist. And I believe the villain's name in that movie was Remington or Reddington or something like that. Well, on the very first episode, he walks into the FBI headquarters totally compliant. He comes and turns himself in. And when they realized who he was, they held him at gunpoint and then they put him in a safety restraint chair because they had prior knowledge of how dangerous he is and things that he had done.
Mhm.
Um, the reason I bring up that analogy is because I don't think anyone looked at that show and thought that was unusual. That's actually how the restraint chair has been used across the country for years, and how many times it's been used at my jail by other staff members. The 620 times I had no involvement whatsoever. But suddenly in this case, it became against the law. And again, that's the crux of why we're appealing this case up to the highest court, because the courts have ruled you can't simply say something is against the law because you don't like it if there's nothing clearly established in the law to say that this is not the case. Here's another thing that's interesting that's happened in this case. Even though my conviction has not been overturned thus far, they never came back with a ruling to say, okay, from this moment on, this is how we use the chair. The court didn't say from this moment on, a person has to be uncontrollably violent, or from this moment on, a person can only be in a chair for 2 hours as opposed to 4 hours. Uh, there were rulings here in the 11th Circuit where a guy was in a chair for 16 hours, and they said, well, that's up to the discretion of the jailers, and that we have to give jailers and wardens great deference and discretion because of what they do. But of course, we know in my case, I wasn't given deference or discretion. And we know why, because there's more to the case than a restraint chair. It's really not a restraint chair. Again, it's related to a political race where I have a DA that has, endorsed other candidates against me. She had an investigator that was on the FBI task force. She just happened to be friends with the federal judge. The judge just happened to be Facebook friends with one of my political opponents. The judge's husband used to work for that DA's office. So this really isn't about the restraint chair. If we really got behind and was honest about this, it has nothing to do with the restraint chair whatsoever. But it was a tool that was used in order to see if they could defeat me from being in office to get somebody else in. But the sad part about that is this. You take a tool that's used in hospitals, that's used in schools. It's a tool that prevents people from hurting themselves, hurting others. It prevents officers from having to use any further uh, force. And now it's no longer being used. And then afterwards, because of a political race, really. And now afterwards, what do we have? 5 people have lost their lives in the jail.
Right, right. Now, I'm going to take it to a bird's eye view. How did you decide which stories to include in Vigilante Sheriff? Because when I read the book, I felt like there was a lot of stories that, of course, naturally wasn't in the book, and I felt like it was left on the cutting floor. So, when you were going through thinking about what to put into the book, what I guess what I'm thinking about more than anything is what were the moments you found particularly challenging when you were revisiting what to put into the book?
It was very challenging, and it probably still challenges me to this day. If everything could have went into the book that I wanted in the book would probably be 3 times the size. The one thing I've learned in my career in public service is, when you give a speech, it needs to be interesting and it needs to be short, or you lose people's attention. So I didn't want to give somebody a long volume to read, but I wanted to make sure that we got to the key points. There was a whole lot more that could be put in the book about the case, about various different parts of things that happened throughout the year, dealing with our particular methods of crime fighting, our particular methods of running a jail, which was we probably had the most safest and secure jail, no cell phones, no drugs. It was ran like a military boot camp. And it could have really went on, but we wanted to get to the point and keep it interesting and not be so long that you lose people's attention.
Right, 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 right. Let's go to the title, which I found fascinating. You know, so Vigilante Sheriff, it just reeks of fearless, independent approach to your leadership. Now, what was some of the concepts that played a role in your tenure as a sheriff to go ahead and say, you know, this is how it shaped your decisions both in and out of office? For example, obviously when I think of Vigilante Sheriff, uh, uh, during the moment while you're in office, of course, you weren't thinking of anything of that. But what were some of the concepts that after you were out of office, after you retired, that lead you to go ahead and pick this particular title?
Well, 2 reasons. Number one, technically, with the contrived charges that they came up with, they were technically trying to say I was a vigilante. They were trying to say that I was punishing criminals as opposed to restraining them for safety, which is just not accurate. So technically, they were trying to say that it was vigilante type justice. But of course, I've always been compared to, like I said, a fictional vigilante, which is the Dark Knight or Batman, and a lot of that came from 2 things. I think the theme of the campaign, which was often I was called a lot crime fighter by a lot of the citizenry, but also the fact that what the origin of the Dark Knight was that he lost his parents to a murder, which caused him to fight crime. Well, as you know, I had a childhood friend that was murdered and actually murdered and mutilated. And that was a catalyst for me to get into law enforcement. Of course, that was a catalyst for me to want to have expertise in one division. As you know from your past, um, in present in law enforcement, there's all type of cops. There's traffic cops, probation cops, but I specifically wanted to concentrate on being a homicide detective, and that's what I wanted to master. And as stated, that's a crime for which there can be no restitution. You
Right,
know,
right.
you can pay restitution for theft, but you can never pay restitution for it to take somebody's life.
Absolutely. So let's go back to the crime fighter persona. And, I'm really interested on the fact of, you're just such a polarizing figure. You have supporters that will back you 100%, and they'll follow you right into the wall. And then you have your critics that are accusing you of abuse left and right.
Hmm.
How do you make peace with that? Well, how do you balance that? Just thinking of those who support you no matter what, and over time, because of your tactics, your crime fighting tactics, how your critics see you. How do you balance that?
Well, how I balance that, and anytime people come to me and ask for advice in those regards, I always tell them the story about the little boy and the elderly man, the old man that took a trip, and they were walking and they were pulling a donkey with them. And they had to go through several villages. And the first village they went through, they could hear people talking about them. And what they heard was people saying, well, hey, why are they both walking and they got a donkey? You would think one of them would ride on a donkey.
Mhm.
So when they got out of that village, the old man picked up the little boy and put him on the donkey, and they went to another village and they could hear people talking again. And what they heard this time was they were saying, um, why is a little kid riding a donkey and an old man walking? You know, the kid has more energy. It just doesn't seem right. So when they got out that village, the old man took the little boy off the donkey and he got up on the donkey. Well, they went to a third village and they could hear people talking again. At this time, they're saying, why does he have that poor kid walking and he's riding a donkey? You would think he would let the kid ride up there with him. Well, when they got out that donkey, the old man picked up the little boy, he put him on the donkey, and then they went to the fourth village, and then they heard people saying, poor donkey, I can't believe those two guys are on top of him. So one thing you got to understand as a leader, everyone is not going to agree with the direction you take the agency in or your particular policies or whatever. There's just no way you can get everybody on board. And you got to be mentally strong enough to realize that. And if you pay too much attention to that, you won't really pay attention to getting the mission done. The real question is, okay, we have a mission, a vision, and we're trying to achieve something, which was lower crime. How do we achieve it? And to do something that actually works. And that's what we did, and it worked.
Mhm.
And the county had a reputation for having a low crime rate and being safe. And then, unfortunately, after this prosecution, the exact opposite happened. Not only do you get 5 murders in the jail, which for county jails, that was the highest murder rate in the state, but you went from a county with low crime, and then it went up, the murder rate in the actual streets went up to an all-time high in the history. So it shows what we were doing both in the jail and the streets was effective.
Right.
Did everybody agree with it? Well, I don't know if everybody agrees with anything. There were people who didn't agree with healing the sick and raising the dead. Not that we're making a comparison, but
Mhm.
that's what happens.
Right. And I think it's important to note that how mentally strong you have to be to walk that line. And I don't think that a lot of people have given you that particular credit. One of the things I did want to ask you about that you did not expound on the book was, of course, your jail, the paramilitary style jail that was nicknamed the Hilton. Can you talk
Yes.
a little bit about that?
Yes. Yeah. You know, most of my career, the majority of my career had nothing to do with a jail. The majority of my time was on the streets and in homicide. So now I'm the sheriff and now I have a jail. And most jails are out of control. You got inmates banging on the walls, masturbating in front of females, throwing urine and feces on people, riding or whatever. And I just knew there had to be a better way. So one of the first things I did was ran the jail like a military boot camp. Most of the young people in jail didn't get a chance to go to the military, and they won't because of some of the crimes they've committed. There's foreign countries I've visited where young people are required to do 2 years in the military or more when they first get out of school. And I've noticed a difference in the culture of those countries and here. And I think instilling that type of discipline in them early seem to have not just an effect on the culture, but the crime rate of the county as well, because everyone gets this particular discipline. So now you got hardened gangbangers, and now they're saying, sir, yes, sir, no, sir. They have to make up their bed. They have to go to attention. It really was very, very effective. We would give tours. Grand juries would come and tour the jail, and they were very, very impressed. And, one day I addressed the inmates. We had given a tour. They were so impressed. I said, the only difference between you right now and the United States military is the uniform and the fact of where you're at and why you're in this particular uniform.
Mhm.
So now what does that tell us? All you need to do is change your uniform. if you can have the same discipline as the military, and you're in a jail uniform, imagine what you can do now that you learn this discipline. And it was just, let me tell you, it was so controlled, so disciplined. Before um, our grandmother passed, when she was like 90 years old, she came and I walked her through maximum security. Most sheriffs don't walk through maximum security. They're too afraid. And I wasn't worried about a thing. It was just military discipline. Sir, yes, sir, ma'am, yes, ma'am, clean, orderly. And she was very impressed, to say the least.
And, I have to say this, I've put many of people in jail and walked them to many different jails in 3 different states. I have never seen a jail that was so orderly, so clean, so disciplined than the time I went to Clayton County Jail to observe what it was all about. I heard about it, you told me about it, but you really can't really fully appreciate it until you go into at least for the likes of people in law enforcement like myself, because this too, that in many instances when we're taking people to prison or to jail, the jails are out of order. Anything goes. You have to even watch out for your own back when you take them through the doors. And it was just one of the most perfectly put in people in their place that I've ever seen. So I really have to go ahead and congratulate you on that. That was, it should be the model all across the United States. And getting to that point, I want you to talk about, because I think that there is an intrinsic value in the meal prep that you used. You know, it was a tool that you were able to use effectively about that. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. It's called special meal management. We refer to it as neutral loaf. You know, you got a jail, and we had nearly 300 people in the jail for murder. And then it was a 1,900 bed facility. You got other people in there for robbery, rape, other violent crimes, aggravated assault, i.e., attempted murder. So, what I was looking for, what we were looking for, was to find nonviolent ways to control violent people, um, such as the restraint chair and such as special meal management. And special meal management is simply made up of oatmeal, um, greens, I believe it was collard greens, corn, and it was all mixed into a loaf full. So it was very, very nutritional. So if we had inmates that were acting out, refusing to comply or whatever, they ate Nutriloaf. As a matter of fact, that's how maximum security got under control. Because in maximum security, all their privileges have been taken anyway. So you can't punish them with lockdown. They're already on lockdown 23 hours a day. So you got these guys beating on the walls, throwing urine and feces at officers. But after 3 days of Nutriloaf, they all became very, very compliant. They started to enjoy the meal that we were giving them and wanted that meal again. And then maximum security became a very disciplined place to be. So we had military discipline in every area of the jail. There were 8 housing units with sections. And I could tell someone pick a number 1 through 6, and I'm picking number 1 through 8. And we would go wherever they picked, and the same level of military discipline would be there. And I want to add one thing, brother. Uh, it wasn't just a discipline. It was a jail free of drugs, free of contraband. And that wasn't rocket science.
Mhm.
You know, most jails, employees can walk into jail in a bunch of different exits and entrances. I closed all of those, and employees can only go through one entrance. And every time an employee went through, they had to be searched, including me. They had to be searched. They had to be scanned. If they went outside for 5 minutes to smoke a cigarette, they had to be searched again. Sometimes we'd have a drug dog there. Why? Because drugs and cell phones and weapons don't float into a jail. They're brought into a jail. So inmates can't do that on their own. They have to have some type of inside or outside assistance. Just by doing that one thing, we had a drug free jail. I actually had an inmate thank me afterwards, someone I still keep in touch with. And he said, I want to thank you for getting me off of drugs. And I was like, how did I get you off drugs? He said, this was the only jail I couldn't get drugs in. So I ended up going cold turkey off of drugs and never went back. I think that perhaps was the highest compliment we could ever gotten.
Let me add to that because I think one of the other highest compliments that you had that came at a moment where you were in front of a federal judge was that when I went to Atlanta and I was sitting, in the gallery, you had many individuals that were in your jail that came to the federal courthouse supporting you.
Yes.
It was probably one of the most fascinating things that I was witnessing at the time there. And, these people stood on your behalf. And that just speaks of the discipline that they, ingratiated into themselves and appreciated that they didn't have before. And so that was good on your part.
I'm glad you said that. People tried to make it sound like this was an abusive jail and I was abusing people's civil rights and yelling and screaming at them. Listen, I did have some very hard conversations with inmates. And there's a lot of people I told don't come back to the county. Yeah, if you're beating up grandmothers at grocery stores, breaking in your grandmother's house, holding guns to people's head, no, I don't want you in Clayton County. If you don't live here, you need not to come. But most of it was very, very appreciated by the inmates. It was just hard conversations, no different than a drill instructor having hard conversations with recruits or whatever. And it was about the behavior and how it wouldn't be tolerated in the county. That's not against the law. None of these inmates were touched. None of them were injured. Uh, and they took a situation that was very positive and painted it as negative all over a political campaign. And the sad part is you'll read in the book the person they were trying to get in office still didn't win.
Right.
So
Right.
there
Right.
you
Right.
have it.
And let's talk about, we're talking about, and just to add a little bit further. So you have the inmates, and as you know, in correctional facilities, they're always going at each other, right?
Yes.
What you were able to do was to go ahead and stop that. And that's where the appreciation was, especially for some of the most recidivist ones that were coming back there over and over and over again, or at least was the first time going to that jail and they experienced other situations in another jail. So there was an appreciation on there. So
And think about this, Jerome. Now you got a situation in jail where not only has there been 5 inmates murdered, numerous stabbings. We can't even count how many of that. We knew after we stopped using the restraint chair because of this political prosecution that assaults on officers went up over 100% and inmate on inmate assaults went up over 200%. That's documented. Well, now you have inmates extorting inmates' families. You got to cash at me a certain amount of money, or we're gonna beat your son or beat your husband or whatever like that. So imagine that you got to send protection money to Cash App. First of all, they shouldn't even have phones to receive the Cash App,
correct.
and that's just how out of control the jail is now. All because a tool that was very effective, that had been used 630 times with no lawsuits, with no complaints, and then you get a political campaign, you get a DA, and we got to remember, we haven't even had time to discuss the backstory. This same DA's office came at me 10 years ago and put RICO charges on me, saying that every time I drove the sheriff's car out of town and put gas in it, it was part of a criminal enterprise. So imagine this, these are what you call creative prosecutors. Well, let's prosecute him because he drove the car out of town. All sheriffs have to do that. I have to get back if there's a murder or something happens to a deputy. Then you come up with this new thing about the restraint chair. So this is something that really needs to be looked into because this is something that's happening across the nation. And that's our next conversation. Grand
Right.
juries and how archaic it is.
Yeah, and Sheriff, I just want to go ahead. Obviously, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to go ahead and say to you, please come back.
Oh, absolutely.
and we need to have further discussions because some of the things that you just hit on right now, I know internally what goes on, and so do you. But we want to give the audience a taste of exactly what goes into the methodology and the logic in doing some of the things that you did. So I really appreciate you coming in, and that's it for today's episode.
I'm honored you had me, brother.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We really do. And we're going to go back at this again.
All right.
That's it for today's episode of The Hill of Justice. I'd like to thank my guest, retired Sheriff Victor Hill. You can pick up his book online on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and other fine book retailers. I'm Jerome Hill. Thank you for subscribing and following. And until next time, thanks.